Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
First one is titled, "My brother used his own suicide to attempt revenge on our mother." By simply Googling my dead brother's name, I uncovered the revenge he attempted to exact on our mother by killing himself. I'm the youngest of 3 boys. My oldest brother committed suicide in 2003 at age 48 without leaving a knot. Here's the story. My oldest brother grew up a conflicted man. He was brilliant and honest, but he had a very volatile relationship with our mother that seemed to center around her attempts to hold onto and control money. We all felt this as we were very poor, but my oldest brother seemed to take her efforts to deny us the basics of life personally. The rest of us felt that our meager lifestyle of yard sale clothes, no toys, barber school haircuts, dented cans and stale bread was simply a product of our poverty. By the time he reached his early 20s, he moved out but continued to stop by and try to engage our mother in arguments designed to teach her the errors in her thinking. This never went well. He eventually went to Brown University on a full scholarship and began teaching in an inner-city setting. It was at this point, around 1987, that he began his descent into depression and major mental illness. He self-medicated with alcohol and anti-depression meds. I could see the changes in him monthly. By 1996, he was not the same person that I grew up with. He picked verbal fights, saw enemies everywhere and began to act out at his job. I later learned that it was around this point, and I'll explain how later, he decided to commit suicide. But he had unfinished business with my mother, so he concocted a twisted scheme aimed to devastate her at her weakest moment. He purchased a secret life insurance policy, named my mother as the beneficiary without her knowledge, and secretly paid the premium every month despite he and his wife having deep financial issues. Of course, his wife knew nothing of the suicide plans or the policy. Insurance policies have a lengthy waiting period before they will pay out in the case of a suicide, but that's okay because my brother wanted to have a little fun before killing himself anyway. His fun included adopting the concern level of a honey badger and messing with every teacher, student, administrator and custodian he disliked. His devastating intellect was his weapon and he used it to embarrass and shock his targets. He eventually was suspended multiple times for verbally assaulting a janitor and for allowing his 7th grade students to cut his hair and drive his car. He also created drama by telling stories of bar fights with famous people and lying to get out of attending meetings. He had become an out-of-control prick and was drinking every day. His wife held it together, but she was beginning to crack under the pressure. All the while, my brother was fine because he knew it would all be over soon and he was living his new life of giving 0 ducks. And his plan to screw with my mother was coming along fine. I attempted to get him into numerous programs. I even cut ties with him from my own children and told him that all he needed to do was to get into a program and, even if he failed, could resume our close contact. He opted to continue his rampage. Our parents saw no real need for concern, so they didn't join with me. My father even expressed anger at me for me giving him that ultimatum. Around 2000, he began predicting his own death to his classes. Knowing that 7th graders are very gullible, he shrouded it with being told by psychics that he would die at home and in a year that ended with a 3. This is what I learned by Googling his name about 8 years after his death. When I did, a link to a video game forum popped up and a PM 8-year-old post by one of his students had made about his teacher dying. This is when I realized that my brother's suicide was planned years before he did it. I emailed that student and he gave me the whole story of my brother riveting the class on several occasions with tales of his own death. Here's the intended revenge plan and its 8 years too late exposure. In 2011, my mother passed. My brother's death 8 years earlier began her mental and physical breakdown. All she wanted to know was, why? Of course we had no idea why. But her death triggered a record search at Prudential Insurance where she had her own policy. My dad had begun the wheels in motion by filing for her payout, and the search kicked back my brother's name because that was, ironically, where he had his secret life insurance policy. The agent asked my dad who the person who came back in the search was, and my dad stated that it was his oldest son who had committed suicide back in 2003. You see, my brother, despite his brilliance, didn't know how life insurance worked, and he assumed that his death would somehow cause his policy to force a payout to my mother. This would have happened when all of us were deep in contemplation as to why he would kill himself, and right then my mother would then get the check. The check was his suicide note directly to my mother alone, and it was the one thing that has dogged their relationship forever: money. But the insurance company did not know of his death in 2003. They assumed he'd just allowed the policy to lapse. My brother's wife knew nothing of the policy, and neither did my mother. My dad, who is 87 and failing, never connected the dots as he doesn't know of my brother predicting his own death. My father provided Prudential with the copy of the death certificate of both my brother and my mother, and they verified that the policy was in force at the time of my brother's suicide and sent my dad the benefits check. I've never told my dad any of this as it would probably kill him. I shared the details with my middle brother, and he agrees that this was exactly what my oldest brother was up to. Edit for clarity. This was my brother's attempt at revenge. Obviously he failed by not understanding that insurance companies need to be notified of someone's death before they pay. And yes, he was in pain and needed help, but he refused it. He claimed that he couldn't relate to average people, who were in AA and wouldn't go. He was an elitist who used his intellect as an excuse to keep drinking and abusing prescription meds. He was deeply, deeply troubled. Next one is titled, High on the Hogs, a story of pro-family revenge. So one of my brothers is adopted and is amazing. He didn't get anything handed to him in life, and he's seriously one of the hardest working people I know. Just as he was starting his own family, he had even more financial burden due to some medical problems. Still, somehow he managed to build half a house on some land my dad sold him. He used the equity in that to get a second loan and finish it, and he had to fight the bank for that even. Time goes on and he begins to do really well, so he sells the first house he built at a profit and buys some land. Like 175 acres in the Midwest. He lives in a rural area. He likes to hunt and does some farming on the land, but the house that was there when he bought it isn't ideal, despite some major improvements and renovation. So he builds a third house and puts the house up for sale. He keeps the land around the house for hunting. This is important later. This is when one of his envious family members asks if he and his wife would consider selling them the house. They can only qualify for something like half of what it's worth, but my brother is a fairly generous guy. He agrees to sell the house to them at a rather hefty discount since they're family. I'm sure he felt some of their pain as well. He'd had his own difficulty back when he was starting out. The bank agrees to loan them the money. They can't go wrong. It's for way less than the property is worth, and the deal is done. A few short months go by. He's driving by the property and spots a for sale sign. He stops in and the husband explains that there were some things about the house they weren't happy with, so they were planning on selling it and buying a house more in town or something, etc. My brother explains that they got a sweet deal only because they were family and that he'd appreciate them selling the house back to him for what he sold it to them for. The husband basically closes the door on that, and my brother leaves. And he thinks about it. I'm 100% certain that the family members understood that they were getting a good deal because they were family, and he was happier selling it to them with the understanding that they weren't to take advantage of his good graces. This is a guy, by the way, that manages big projects. He's a really fair guy. The stuff he does in construction probably half of you have driven over. Big bridges that go over rivers like the Mississippi, for example. He's used to solving hard problems. This one isn't that hard. The next day he drives out with some fence in the back of his truck, and the family members in the house wake up to some fence posts being driven into the ground. The husband comes out. "What's going on?" he asks. "I'm just putting up some hog fence on my property. Don't worry, it's all on my land." I'll just go around your house here and put a gate in so you can get in and out. The husband is a bit perplexed. You're bringing in pigs? And my brother was seriously set to do it too. He had about 100 lined up from a farmer down the road. The husband goes back into the house. A few minutes of discussion occur. The next day they all meet at the bank and the deed is transferred back to my brother. And he didn't even have to deploy the hogs. Next one is titled, Lawyer and Judge in a Pub Help Me Get Revenge on Rent-Dodging Tenant. So I rented a room in my place out to a guy who seemed decent for 9 months. He was an admin at a law firm nearby and seemed like a pretty stand-up guy. No real problems up until the last 2 months when he started getting late on rent repayments. However, a simple, "Dude, it's Sunday, where's the rent?" would get me immediate payment. One week the rent didn't come and I was barely home all week. It came in about $50 short and I planned to raise the issue with him the next time I saw him. The next week there was no rent, so I wrote up a notice to terminate the tenancy and hyped myself up for the confrontation when I got home. I walk in the door and all of his furniture has gone, his room cleaned out, no keys returned, the bathroom and kitchen intentionally left a ducking mess. It looks like he cut his hair in the bath and didn't bother to clean it either. Yuck. So immediately I noticed some items which were mine were missing and called the cops to report a theft. They weren't too interested but took the details down. They said it was pretty much a my word versus his matter, but they would investigate it nonetheless. The first step of revenge. So I am a member of a fairly exclusive club in the city which is frequented by judges, barristers and legal professionals as well as bankers and accountants. Think of when you see those old rich men clubs in the city, like in American Psycho, Boardwalk Empire and movies, where you can have a drink and chat with other members. I got talking with an old bloke at the bar and over a few beers my issue came up. Turns out this guy owns a firm and has been practicing family law for 30 years. He calls over his buddies who are a judge and barrister. They then helped me draft a letter to the principal of his law firm informing her of her staff members' actions and that I am willing to talk to the Law Society, of which one of these guys is a governing member. According to these guys, any senior partner at any firm would rather receive 100 lashes than have the Law Society brand them as unethical. The letter went in the mail yesterday and if all goes as planned he will either be losing his job and the possibility of working in the legal world ever again or be forced by his boss to pay me what he owes plus cleaning bills on threat of the former. Damn happy I stepped into that club yesterday. Next one is titled, Say Goodbye to Your Check. Short and sweet. I was waiting in line at the bank. They have you line up outside, not a problem. This particular day it was a bit windy, again not a problem for me. A guy gets out of his car, check in hand. You know where this is going, huh? The wind whips the check from his hands and somehow I managed to step on it as it scooted by me. I wasn't really expecting a thank you to be honest. But what I definitely wasn't expecting was the guy to chew me out for dirtying up his check. Thanks for stepping on my check, the bank probably won't accept it now. Call me in a hole, but I lifted my foot up and let it blow away in the wind down the street and said, well, they definitely won't accept it now. The guy flipped his crap as he was chasing it down the street and I got called up as next in line. Sorry not sorry. Last one is titled, Worst Thing I've Done to Anyone. This story starts out back almost 10 or 12 years ago. I had a pretty good job as a land surveyor, made a good living, life was good. The rodman I had at the time, he had to quit due to health reasons, so I got a brand new helper. All was going okay until he decided to be a complete witch. The job involved covering some pretty rough terrain, lot of swamps, chopping line in the Florida summers, crapload of snakes out. Great job for me, but for this guy, it was a reason to gripe and tell me just how much money he should be getting paid, you know the kind. Well, after a particular clusterfuck of a job, we have to set a few property corners and get back to the shop. No, this guy is too good to stay half an hour later to actually finish a job, and proceeds to call his fiancée to come pick him up. By the time she got there to pick him up, I'd went and set the rods by myself. It rather pissed me off. Well, the guy, being the pompous butt that he was, had given me his business card for a window tinting thing he did out of his garage a few weeks earlier. He had also been complaining that his neighbors were gay. Wheels began to turn in my head, and I had a nice little duck you plan in no time. After work, I went over to Lillian, Alabama, where the porn shops are, and found a nice guy on Guy Mag, and asked the cashier for a subscription form for it. On the way home, I stopped in a Circle K and got a money order for 1 year's worth of the mag. With his address from the card, and a nighttime drive-by, I got his neighbor's address. I filled it out in his name to his neighbor's address and mailed it in. About a month later, he come into work looking like someone had just kicked his puppy. Boss asked him what was wrong, and even I was not expecting the reply. My fiancée called it off. She thinks I'm gay. My plan worked a bit too well. The neighbors got the mags in his name, and went over to give them to him, but she was the one they gave them to. She opened the black plastic, and the shit hit the fan. I was biting the inside of my lips till they bled to keep from laughing, because this big corn-fed country boy would have killed me if he knew I was the reason the love of his life walked out and left him. Thanks for listening.